Hello and welcome back to the channel. In the last couple of videos, I talked about the importance of understanding new content versus memorizing it, and talked about some principles that I use to develop that understanding. What I'm going to talk about in this video is how I then take that understanding and develop a system that enables me to maintain that understanding in the long term. Essentially what this involves is creating some kind of central document where I have a reference of the content that I've covered and a record of my understanding, and I'll refer to that over time using a spaced repetition based system, which I'll explain in the next video. And essentially what this master document includes is a reference to all of the relevant material on this subject. So that might be things like lecture notes, any useful screen clippings of things I came across on the internet, maybe trimmings out of textbooks, or just anything that is remotely useful for a future reference, but not necessarily as something that I'm going to read from front to back. What I also include is my own summary notes, and I'll explain a bit about the approach I take to making those. And then at the top, I will have any outstanding unanswered questions on this topic, things that I don't understand. I'll also have some questions to prompt myself to actively recall the content, because that's a much more effective way to recap content that you've already covered. And I'll also explain a bit more about that in the next video. So I personally like to use the software OneNote, because what's cool about it is it just lets you add content kind of continuously in an ever expanding space, as you can see here. If I zoom out, then I've got kind of content that goes on and on in multiple different dimensions. And this will be my central reference document on this topic for the rest of my life. So this one is about logistic regression, which I covered in the second week of my master's degree on machine learning. And if at any point in the future I learn more about logistic regression, I'll put it here. And if I ever want to recap the topic, this is the first place that I will go. Now, the approach that I personally take to build this resource up is, firstly, I will just paste any lecture notes that we have on logistic regression into this document. So here, I posted the lecture notes that we had covering logistic regression into this document, and I've posted a few other kind of snippets which I think were related to logistic regression or some kind of principles that help underlie this. And that's kind of the starting point. If I come across anything useful on the internet, I'll take a screen clipping, which I can do on my Mac, just short key, Control-Shift-4. Let's say I'm doing a Andrew Ng course on logistic regression. So as you can see, I've watched this video before and I really liked it, so I gave it a thumbs up. But this is a course where Andrew Ng explains logistic regression. So let's say that I'm watching this to build up my understanding of the subject, and there's a really useful graph that he draws. And let's say that I find this particular slide super useful. On my Mac, I press Control-Shift-4. I'll then just cut that. I'll then go over to OneNote and I will then drop that in the document. And let's say I might put some notes around it. So I might put it here in my mix notes and put, this is an amazing diagram from Andrew Ng. If I want to refer to it in future, then I can also put this in here and maybe put a timestamp. I don't want to keep that. Yeah, so then I will basically just drop any useful things. As you can see, I've done here. These are actually all from Andrew Ng's video. That helps this to then become a kind of central reference document with information that I can refer to back in the future. But my intention is not to fully reread through this material again, maybe ever, but I want to keep it there as a nice reference. Because instead what I will focus on is, after I've spent all my time making sure I understand the subject using the principles that I outlined in the previous two videos, I'll end that study session where I've tried to develop the best understanding that I can on the subject with writing a summary of my current understanding at that point, kind of like a note to myself in the future. And generally the approach that I'll take with these notes is that they're fairly informal, and I'm just kind of writing them for my future self. I don't try and write a sort of authoritative summary of the subject, and I'll often use pretty informal language in there and maybe even indicate that there's parts I don't fully understand. So if I look through these notes here, which I made on logistic regression, then there are probably some parts here where, yeah, so I've put like, I think this may be something to do with the log being cancelled out. I'm not too sure. I had to prioritize when I was studying the subject, so I didn't spend time looking into whether or not that's the case, but I think that it might be. To be honest, I still don't know if it's the answer. If you do know, drop a comment below and let me know. But essentially, it's just kind of a very informal outline of my current understanding for me to then refer back to. And this is the approach that I found most efficient, because I find, in general, if I try and make some like really systematic summary notes of the content, then actually that ends up being pretty inefficient. And what I often do is I'll keep looking at the resource, look back at my notes, write a little bit more on my notes, look back at the resource, keep kind of going back and forth, and it's actually just a very inefficient way of doing it. Whereas if I study it, try and develop the understanding, and then come to a document and just write out everything that I understand of that subject at that time, then that's much more efficient, because I am recalling everything from my own brain, so I'll remember it better. And sometimes that will also highlight maybe that there's something I didn't fully understand. I'm happy to put that as like a note. Maybe I should try and understand this in future, or maybe if I have time, I'll go away and fill that gap. Yeah, and in general, I think I mentioned this, but just to reiterate the importance of setting a time restriction on the amount of time I spend studying a new subject and then writing these summary notes. I typically spend maybe an hour or so on new content, perhaps reviewing a lecture or a couple of lectures that I had on a topic, because beyond there, I find that I start to enter the region of the law of diminishing returns. There's a law called Parkinsons Law, which is that work expands the amount of time that you allocate to doing it. And sometimes I find if I don't restrict myself, then I might spend ages going down a little rabbit hole of things which are semi-relevant to what I'm trying to learn and somewhat interesting, but actually that's not the top priority for what I should be learning in that moment. And again, it slips into a slightly less efficient way to study. One personal mindset shift that I found really helped with this is being happy to leave things unanswered. So I used to find that when I studied a subject, I wanted to, in that session, develop a full understanding of that subject and try and just do my best to get through and understand everything that was covered. But now the approach that I take, which I found personally is way more efficient, is that I'm very happy to leave parts of that unanswered. And I used to worry that if I didn't cover everything on that first pass through the subject, that I may never come back round to it and understand those areas. But what I find useful about using this question-based approach is that if there's some areas that I don't understand, I will have some questions pointing to those areas of lack of understanding, and I can keep those questions in that document for future reference, so I don't have to worry that I'll never understand that concept. So here, if we look at the document, I've got my notes for reference, I've got these questions and answers that I did for myself, I've got these notes, so these are the summary notes that I wrote kind of at the end of a study session to reiterate my understanding. And then what I've got here is I have some questions to still understand / think about / review a couple of points which, when I was reviewing this the first time, I didn't fully understand. So I didn't fully understand this concept of maximum likelihood and how probability is calculated and the relation between this and Bayesian thinking. Now, the other thing I like to include at the top of every document, as well as this prompt of areas I don't understand, is some questions to prompt my recall of the subject. Okay, so I'm gonna go to a different notebook here about ensemble methods. What I will do after I've reviewed the content, developed the understanding, and then written these summary notes is I'll write some questions to kind of test myself or to recall content in the future, because there's lots of evidence that actively recalling the information rather than just reading your notes is a much more efficient way to retain that understanding. So what I will do is at the top of the document, I have my to understand part, and then I also have this part where I have some self-test questions, so that then in the future when I return to this document, rather than looking through all of the notes that I have, the first thing I will look at is this self-test part, and I will say, okay, here, recall bagging and boosting, and I will think from my memory, okay, what is bagging, what is boosting, and I will here recall the mathematical principles behind why using a committee has less errors than individuals. And this is all fairly specific machine learning concepts, but no matter what I'm studying, I will make sure that I include this. So then that's the first thing I do when I come back to the documents. And with these recall questions, these are separate from the to understand questions, because these are all questions I already know and understand, but I'm just putting that recall question there so that I can prompt myself to recall that understanding at some point in the future. So yeah, that's the rough outline of this master document, which I create for all the topics that I cover. So as you can see, sometimes the exact topic name and subtitle vary, but the key principle is I have my reference material, I have my summary notes that I write from memory, I have the self-test questions that I'll prompt myself with in the future, and I will also have some outstanding questions or areas of understanding that I need to develop. I feel like I might have repeated myself in there a little bit, but essentially this is the central document that I make. But now that I have that centralized document, the next step is to enter that into my spaced repetition-based system, which I'll explain in the next video. Go on about my life, do something else, and then when the time comes, come back and reiterate that content. So I hope you enjoyed that video, and I'll see you in the next one.